In the grand cathedral of St. George's, where centuries of noble marriages had been blessed and witnessed, Lady Emily Harcourt walked down the endless aisle in a gown of ivory silk that felt more like a shroud than a wedding dress. At 19, with golden hair that caught the light filtering through stained glass windows and violet eyes that sparkled with unshed tears, she was the picture of reluctant beauty being sacrificed on the altar of family duty. The man waiting for her at the altar was Duke Charles Davenport, 42 years old, devastatingly handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, and possessed of a reputation that made even hardened lords step carefully around him. Known throughout London society as the Iron Duke, he commanded respect through sheer force of will and an intellect that could destroy reputations with a single cutting remark. Emily had met him exactly 3 times before this moment. Once at her debut ball where he had barely glanced in her direction, once at a dinner party where he had spoken to her for precisely 4 minutes about the weather, and once when he had come to formally ask her father for her hand, a conversation she had not been permitted to attend. Now, as she approached the altar where her future husband waited with an expression as unreadable as carved marble, Emily felt as though she were walking toward her own execution. The age difference seemed insurmountable. He was old enough to be her father, sophisticated where she was naive, powerful where she was powerless. But what Emily could not know, as she fought back tears and tried to remember how to breathe, was that the man she was about to marry harbored his own fears about this arranged union. Charles Davenport had built his reputation on being untouchable, unreadable, and utterly in control of every situation. But the sight of his young bride's obvious distress was already beginning to crack the armor he had spent decades constructing around his heart. Lady Emily Harcourt stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom at Harcourt House, watching her lady's maid make final adjustments to her wedding gown. The reflection staring back at her seemed like a stranger, a young woman with golden blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style beneath a family tiara, violet eyes that should have been sparkling with joy but instead held barely contained panic, and a face that was pale despite the rouge carefully applied to her cheeks. "You look beautiful, my lady," said Margaret, her maid, though even she couldn't quite hide the sympathy in her voice. Emily managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Margaret, though I fear beauty will not make this any easier." The door opened and her mother, the Countess of Harcourt, swept in wearing a gown of deep blue silk and an expression of determined satisfaction. "Emily, darling, you look absolutely radiant," Lady Harcourt said, though her eyes held a hint of guilt that she quickly suppressed. "The Duke of Davenport is waiting, and the cathedral is filled with the finest members of society. This is your moment to shine." "Mother," Emily said quietly, turning from the mirror to face the woman who had arranged this marriage, "I must ask you once more, is there truly no other way? Could we not have waited? Perhaps found someone closer to my own age?" Lady Harcourt's expression hardened slightly. "Emily, we have discussed this at length. Your father's debts are considerable, and the Duke's offer was extraordinarily generous. More importantly, Charles Davenport is one of the most powerful men in England. You will be a duchess, with position and security that many women would envy. But mother, he's so cold, so intimidating. I've barely spoken to him, and when I have, he looks at me as though I'm a child playing dress-up." "You are 19 years old, Emily. Many women marry at your age, and to men they know far less well than you know the Duke. Besides," Lady Harcourt's voice softened slightly, "Charles Davenport is a gentleman. He will treat you with respect and courtesy." Emily wanted to point out that respect and courtesy were cold comfort when facing a lifetime with a man who seemed to regard her as little more than a business transaction. But she knew it would be futile. The contracts had been signed, the settlements agreed upon, and the cathedral was indeed filled with guests waiting to witness her surrender to duty. "It's time, my lady," Margaret said gently, offering Emily her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. As Emily took the flowers, her hands trembled slightly. She had dreamed of her wedding day since childhood, but never like this. Never with a sense of dread instead of joy. Never walking toward a man who was essentially a stranger. The carriage ride to St. George's Cathedral passed in a blur of London streets, and her father's awkward attempts at reassurance. Lord Harcourt was a kind man who clearly felt guilty about the necessity of this arrangement, but his relief at having his financial troubles solved was equally evident. "Emily," he said, as their carriage approached the cathedral, "I want you to know that if I had any other choice—" "I know, Papa," Emily said, squeezing his hand. "I understand the necessity. I only pray that understanding will be enough to see me through." The cathedral was indeed magnificent, filled with flowers and the cream of London society. As Emily walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her, some with sympathy, others with curiosity about how this unlikely match would unfold. But it was the man waiting at the altar who commanded her attention. Duke Charles Davenport stood with perfect posture, his dark hair showing distinguished silver at the temples, his grey eyes unreadable as they watched her approach. He was undeniably handsome in a mature, commanding way that spoke of power and authority. His formal wedding attire, a dark blue coat with silver buttons, pristine white waistcoat, and perfectly arranged cravat, emphasized his aristocratic bearing. As Emily drew closer, she searched his face for any sign of warmth or reassurance, but found only polite composure. When she reached the altar, and her father placed her hand in Charles's, she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Charles Edward Davenport, Duke of Davenport, and Lady Emily Catherine Harcourt." Emily tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept wandering to the man beside her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of his 42 years, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, could feel the controlled strength in his hand as it held hers. He was intimidating not just because of his reputation, but because of the sheer force of his presence. "Do you, Charles Edward Davenport, take Lady Emily Catherine Harcourt to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Charles said, his voice deep and steady. "Do you, Lady Emily Catherine Harcourt, take Charles Edward Davenport to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Emily's throat felt dry, but she managed to speak clearly. "I do." As Charles slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his mother, Emily felt the weight of her new identity settling around her like a cloak. She was no longer Lady Emily Harcourt, but the Duchess of Davenport, wife to one of the most powerful men in England. "You may kiss the bride." Charles turned to face her fully, and for a moment Emily saw something flicker in his grey eyes. Was it uncertainty? But before she could be sure, he leaned down and kissed her gently, a brief, formal touch of lips that was appropriate for the public setting, but told her nothing about the man she had just married. The cathedral erupted in polite applause, and Emily forced herself to smile as they turned to face their guests as husband and wife. But inside, her heart was racing with anxiety about what came next. The wedding breakfast at Davenport House was an elaborate affair, with hundreds of guests celebrating in the grand ballroom. Emily moved through the reception in a daze, accepting congratulations and making polite conversation, while her new husband remained at her side, playing the part of the attentive bridegroom with perfect precision. "Your Grace looks absolutely radiant," gushed Lady Pemberton, one of society's most influential hostesses. "What a magnificent match this is." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Emily replied, still adjusting to being addressed as Your Grace. "You're very kind." "The Duke is a fortunate man indeed," Lady Pemberton continued, glancing meaningfully at Charles, "though I suspect he knows exactly how fortunate." Charles inclined his head politely. "Indeed I do, Lady Pemberton. My wife is everything I could have hoped for." The formal politeness of his response made Emily's heart sink slightly. Even his compliments sounded like diplomatic statements rather than genuine sentiment. As the afternoon wore on, Emily found herself watching her new husband carefully, trying to understand the man she had married. He was unfailingly courteous to their guests, demonstrating the social skills that had made him such a powerful figure in political circles. But she noticed that his smiles never quite reached his eyes, and that he maintained a careful distance even in casual conversation. "You seem thoughtful, my dear," Charles said during a brief moment when they were relatively alone. Emily looked up at him, surprised by the observation. "I suppose I'm still adjusting to all of this," she said honestly. "It's rather overwhelming." "I imagine it is," Charles replied, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. "If it's any consolation, I find large social gatherings rather tiresome myself." "You do?" Emily asked, surprised. "But you seem so comfortable with it all." "Years of practice," Charles said, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. The ability to appear comfortable and actually being comfortable are two very different things. Before Emily could respond, they were interrupted by another round of well-wishes, and the moment of potential connection was lost. As evening approached and the last guests finally departed, Emily found herself alone with her husband for the first time since their brief encounters during their courtship. They stood in the grand foyer of Davenport House, and the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I trust you found the day satisfactory?" Charles asked formally. "Yes, thank you." "Everything was beautiful," Emily replied, though her voice sounded small in the vast space. "Good. I've had your belongings moved to the Duchess's chambers. Mrs. Whitmore will show you the way when you're ready." Emily nodded, suddenly feeling very young and very alone. "And you, Your Grace, will you be—" "I have some correspondence to attend to in my study," Charles said, his tone giving nothing away. "I'll join you later this evening." The implication of his words made Emily's cheeks burn with embarrassment and anxiety. Their wedding night, the duty she had been dreading since the engagement, was announced. "Of course," she managed to say. I'll be ready." Charles studied her face for a moment, and Emily thought she saw something soften in his expression. "Emily," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time that day, "there's no need to be afraid." "I'm not afraid," Emily said quickly, though they both knew it was a lie. "Of course not," Charles said, and this time she was certain she saw a hint of a smile. "Until later, then." As Emily made her way to her new chambers, guided by the kindly housekeeper, she tried to prepare herself for whatever the night might bring. She had been given the basic facts by her mother, but the clinical explanation had done little to ease her nervousness about the intimate duties of marriage, especially with a man who remained such an enigma to her. The Duchess's chambers were magnificent, a suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and golds, with a sitting area, a dressing room, and a bedroom dominated by a massive four-poster bed. Emily's belongings looked small and out of place in the grand space, reminders that she was still a stranger in her own home. Margaret helped her change from her wedding gown into a nightgown of white silk and lace that her mother had insisted was appropriate for a wedding night. As Emily sat at the dressing table while Margaret brushed out her long golden hair, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the frightened young woman staring back at her. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Margaret asked gently. "No, thank you, Margaret. You may go." Alone in the vast chamber, Emily paced nervously, jumping at every sound in the corridor outside. When she finally heard the soft knock at the connecting door to the Duke's chambers, her heart began racing so fast she thought it might burst. "Come in," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles entered wearing a dark blue dressing gown, his hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it. In the soft lamplight, he looked less intimidating than he had during the formal ceremonies of the day, but Emily still felt overwhelmed by his presence. "Emily," he said, stopping a respectful distance away from her. Before anything else, I have something for you." Emily looked up in surprise. "A gift?" "In a manner of speaking," Charles said, reaching into the pocket of his dressing gown and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I wanted you to have this tonight, before we begin our marriage in earnest." With trembling hands, Emily took the paper and unfolded it. As she read the contents, her eyes widened in shock and disbelief. It was a legal document signed and sealed that granted her an annual allowance of £5,000, a fortune in her own right, that would be hers regardless of the circumstances of their marriage. More than that, it included provisions for her comfort and security that went far beyond what any marriage contract required. "I don't understand," Emily said, looking up at him with confusion. "Why would you—" "Because I want you to know that you have choices," Charles said quietly. "I know this marriage was not your choice, Emily. I know you were given to me to solve your family's financial difficulties, but I want you to understand that you are not trapped here. If you find that you cannot be happy as my wife, if you discover that our arrangement is unbearable to you, you have the means to live independently." Emily stared at him, speechless. This was not what she had expected from the cold, intimidating man she had married. "I realize that £5,000 a year may not seem like much to someone accustomed to living as a duke's daughter," Charles continued, "but it would be enough to maintain a comfortable household, perhaps in Bath or Brighton, if you chose to leave London society behind. You would let me go?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I would not keep you against your will," Charles said firmly. "Marriage should not be a prison, Emily, regardless of the circumstances that brought it about." Emily looked down at the document again, then back at her husband's face. For the first time since their engagement had been announced, she saw genuine emotion in his grey eyes, not the cold calculation she had expected, but something that looked almost like kindness. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Because I remember what it was like to be young and powerless," he said finally. "Because I've seen what happens when people are trapped in situations they cannot escape. And because you deserve better than to spend your life afraid of your own husband." Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not the tears of fear and despair that had threatened all day, but something else entirely. "Charles," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. Thank you. I never expected." "I hope you'll never need to use it," Charles said. "I hope that we can find a way to make this marriage work, to build something good together. But I wanted you to know from the very beginning that the choice will always be yours." As Emily looked at this man who had just given her the one thing she had never expected to have, freedom, she felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the overwhelming terror that had consumed her all day. Instead, she felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become trust. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. "I want to try, Charles. I want to see if we can make this work." Charles's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. "Then we'll try together," he said simply. "And Emily, there's no rush for anything tonight. We have the rest of our lives to figure this out." For the first time since walking down that endless aisle, Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the gift, for the kindness, for giving me hope." As Charles reached out and gently touched her hand, Emily realized that perhaps this marriage, which had seemed like the end of her dreams, might actually be the beginning of something she had never dared to imagine, a partnership built on respect, understanding, and maybe, eventually, love. The morning after Emily woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and the disorienting realization that she was no longer in her childhood bedroom at Harcourt House. For a moment, she lay still, taking in the elegant blue and gold decor of the Duchess's chambers at Davenport House, before the memories of the previous day came flooding back. Her wedding, her new husband, and most surprisingly, his extraordinary gift of independence. She turned her head and was relieved to find herself alone in the massive four-poster bed. Charles had been true to his word about there being no rush. After their conversation, he had simply kissed her hand goodnight and retired to his own chambers, leaving Emily to process the unexpected turn her wedding night had taken. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Emily called, sitting up and pulling the coverlet around herself. Margaret entered carrying a tea tray, followed by Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, a capable-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and greying hair arranged in a neat bun. "Good morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore said with a curtsy. "I hope you slept well. His Grace asked me to inform you that he's been called away on urgent business this morning, but he hopes to return in time for dinner." Emily felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, and please could you show me around the house today? I'd like to become familiar with my new home." "Of course, Your Grace. It would be my pleasure." After breakfast, Emily spent the morning touring Davenport House with Mrs. Whitmore. The mansion was even grander than she had realized, room after room of elegant furnishings, priceless artwork, and centuries of accumulated wealth and taste. "The library is His Grace's favorite room," Mrs. Whitmore explained, as they entered a magnificent space lined floor to ceiling with books. "He spends most of his evenings here when he's not entertaining." Emily ran her fingers along the leather spines, impressed by the breadth of the collection. "He's well read, then?" "Oh, yes, Your Grace. His Grace is considered one of the most intelligent men in Parliament. He speaks 4 languages fluently and has written several papers on political theory." Emily absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of the man she had married. The cold, intimidating Duke was apparently also a scholar. "Mrs. Whitmore," Emily said carefully, "may I ask, what was His Grace like before? I mean, has he always been so reserved?" The housekeeper paused in her dusting, considering her words carefully. "His Grace has had his share of difficulties, Your Grace. Losing his parents at a young age, inheriting such responsibilities so early, it changes a person. But he's a good man, truly. Fair to his tenants, generous with his staff, and absolutely devoted to his duties. He inherited young? At 22, Your Grace. His father died suddenly and his mother followed within the year. Some say it was grief, others say it was the fever. But either way, His Grace found himself alone with a dukedom to run, and no one to guide him. Emily felt a pang of sympathy. She had been so focused on her own fears about their marriage that she hadn't considered what might have shaped Charles into the guarded man he had become. That afternoon, Emily settled in the morning room to write letters to her family, informing them of her safe arrival at her new home. As she was sealing the last envelope, she heard voices in the entrance hall and recognized Charles's deep tones. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of the morning room, still wearing his traveling clothes and looking somewhat tired. "Emily," he said, inclining his head politely, "I hope you've had a pleasant day settling in." "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Whitmore gave me a tour of the house. It's magnificent." "I'm glad you approve." Charles paused, then seemed to make a decision. "Emily, I was wondering if you might join me for dinner tonight, just the two of us. I thought it might be an opportunity for us to become better acquainted." Emily felt a flutter of nervousness, but also curiosity. "I'd like that very much." "Excellent. Shall we say 8 o'clock in the small dining room? It's more intimate than the formal dining hall." That evening, Emily took extra care with her appearance, choosing a gown of deep rose silk that complemented her coloring. When she entered the small dining room, she found Charles waiting for her, having changed into evening dress. The room was lit by candles rather than the usual bright chandeliers, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. "You look lovely," Charles said as he held her chair for her, and Emily was pleased to hear genuine warmth in his voice. "Thank you. You're very kind." As they dined on excellent food served by discreet footmen, Charles made an obvious effort to put Emily at ease, asking about her interests and sharing stories about the house and its history. "The portrait in the main stairway is of my great-grandmother," he explained. "She was apparently quite the scandal in her day. She eloped with a younger son and was disowned by her family for 6 months." "What happened after 6 months?" Emily asked, genuinely curious. "Her husband proved himself in battle and was granted lands and a title of his own. Suddenly, the family was quite eager to welcome them back." Charles's tone was dry, but Emily caught a hint of amusement in his eyes. "It seems love has a way of conquering social obstacles," Emily observed. "Sometimes," Charles agreed, his expression becoming more serious, "though it requires courage from both parties." Emily sensed there was more to his comment than simple observation, but before she could pursue it, Charles changed the subject. "I understand you're fond of reading?" "Very much so. I noticed your library this morning. It's extraordinary. Please consider it yours as well. I'd be interested to know what you think of some of the newer acquisitions." As the evening progressed, Emily found herself relaxing in Charles's company. Away from the formal settings of their previous encounters, he revealed himself to be intelligent, well-informed, and possessed of a subtle sense of humor that surprised her. "Charles," she said as they finished their dessert, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you agree to this marriage? I mean, you could have married anyone. Why choose an arrangement with someone you barely knew?" Charles was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Practical reasons initially," he said finally. "I need an heir, and your family's lineage is impeccable. But also," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I've observed you at social gatherings, Emily. You're intelligent, kind and genuine, qualities that are rarer in our circles than they should be." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You've been observing me." "Not in any improper way," Charles said quickly, "but yes, I've noticed you. The way you speak kindly to servants, how you listen when others talk, rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak. These things matter more than many people realize." Emily was touched by his words, but also curious. "And you? What should I know about you, beyond what society sees?" Charles smiled ruefully. "That's a dangerous question, Emily. Are you certain you want an honest answer?" "I think honesty is the only way we'll ever truly know each other." "Very well." Charles set down his wineglass and looked directly at her. "I'm not the cold, calculating man that society believes me to be. I've simply learned that showing emotion or vulnerability in my position is often seen as weakness. I've been managing this dukedom and its responsibilities since I was barely older than you are now, and I've made mistakes, some of them costly ones that affected real people's lives." Emily leaned forward, drawn in by this glimpse of the man behind the title. "What kind of mistakes?" "I trusted the wrong advisors early on, made investments that failed, and cost tenant families their livelihoods. I was too proud to ask for help when I should have, and too inexperienced to recognize when I was being manipulated." Charles's voice was heavy with old regret. "I learned to be cautious, to keep my own counsel, to never show uncertainty. It served me well in business and politics, but I fear it's made me rather distant in personal relationships. Is that why you've never married before? Emily asked gently. Partly. I was also rather busy trying to repair the damage I'd done and build something stable for the future. Charles met her eyes. But I'm 42 years old, Emily. I can't put off the question of an heir indefinitely, and I find that I'm tired of being alone. The vulnerability in his admission made Emily's heart ache. You don't have to be alone anymore, she said softly. I mean, I know this isn't a love match, but perhaps we can be companions? Friends? Charles's expression softened. I'd like that very much, Emily. More than you might realize. As they rose from the table, Charles offered Emily his arm. Would you care to see the library by evening light? The sunset through the west windows is quite spectacular. Emily accepted his arm, noting how natural it felt to walk beside him. In the library, the setting sun did indeed cast beautiful golden light across the room, illuminating the rich leather bindings and creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. It's beautiful, Emily breathed, moving to the windows to watch the sun sink toward the horizon. Yes, Charles agreed, though when Emily glanced at him, she realized he was looking at her rather than the sunset. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Charles cleared his throat and stepped back. Emily, I want you to know that last night's conversation still stands. You have choices, always, but I hope you'll give us time to see what we might build together. Emily turned to face him fully, studying his face in the golden light. Charles, may I be completely honest with you? Please. I was terrified of you yesterday, terrified of this marriage, of spending my life with a stranger who seemed so cold and intimidating. But today, tonight, I'm beginning to see that there's much more to you than that reputation suggests. And how do you feel now? Charles asked quietly. Emily considered the question carefully. Hopeful, she said finally. Curious to know more about the man I married, and grateful for your patience and kindness. Charles stepped closer, close enough that Emily could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. Emily, I want you to know that your happiness matters to me, not just because you're my wife, but because you deserve to be happy. And what about your happiness? Emily asked. What would make you happy, Charles? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. A real partnership, he said finally. Someone to share the burdens and joys of life with. Someone who sees me as more than just a title or a political alliance. I think I can do that, Emily said, surprised by her own certainty. I'd like to try, at least. Charles reached out and gently took her hand, raising it to his lips to press a soft kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll try together, he said. And Emily, thank you for giving us a chance. As Emily looked into her husband's eyes in the golden light of the library, she realized that the fear that had consumed her for weeks was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something much more promising, the possibility of genuine affection, respect, and perhaps, eventually, love. The gradual awakening. 3 weeks into their marriage, Emily was beginning to settle into the rhythms of life as the Duchess of Davenport. She had established her own routines, morning correspondence in the sunny breakfast room, afternoons spent reading in the library or walking in the gardens, and evenings that increasingly included dinner conversations with Charles that stretched long into the night. She was discovering that her husband was a fascinating conversationalist when he allowed himself to relax. He had traveled extensively in his youth, spoke knowledgeably about art and literature, and possessed a dry wit that often caught her by surprise. The French ambassador's wife cornered me at Lady Pemberton's soirée yesterday, Emily told Charles over dinner one evening. She was quite insistent that I share my beauty secrets with her. Charles raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. And what did you tell her? That I sleep 8 hours a night and drink plenty of water, Emily replied with a laugh. I don't think it was the answer she was hoping for. Madame Dubois has always been convinced that English women possess some secret formula for maintaining their complexions, Charles said. I'm afraid your practical answer probably disappointed her greatly. Should I have invented something more exotic? Perhaps claimed I bathe in milk and honey? Only if you wanted to find yourself inundated with requests for the recipe, Charles replied, his eyes twinkling with genuine humor. These moments of easy conversation had become precious to Emily. She was learning that beneath Charles's formal exterior lay a man of considerable warmth and intelligence, one who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. Charles, Emily said, setting down her wineglass, I've been thinking about what you said regarding your early mistakes as Duke. Would you Would you tell me more about that time? I'd like to understand what shaped you. Charles's expression grew more serious, but he didn't retreat into the formal distance she had come to recognize as his defense mechanism. It's not a particularly pleasant story, he warned. I'm not looking for pleasant stories, Charles. I'm looking to know my husband. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. When my father died, I inherited not just the title and estates, but also a considerable amount of debt that he had hidden from everyone, including my mother. The previous duke, my grandfather, had been an excellent steward of the family fortune, but my father was less disciplined with money. Emily listened intently as Charles continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when discussing difficult subjects. I was 22, grieving, and completely unprepared for the reality of what I'd inherited. The estate managers assured me they could handle everything, that I needn't concern myself with the details. I was so overwhelmed that I let them take control while I focused on learning my duties in Parliament. But they weren't trustworthy. They were embezzling funds and making investments that benefited them rather than the estate. By the time I realized what was happening, several tenant families had lost their homes because repairs weren't being made, and the estate was in worse financial condition than when I'd inherited it. Emily could hear the pain in his voice, even after all these years. What did you do? I dismissed the managers, took control of everything myself, and spent the next 5 years learning every aspect of estate management while working to repair the damage. I sold off some of the less productive properties, invested in improvements to the remaining lands, and personally visited every tenant family to assess their needs. That must have been incredibly difficult, Emily said softly. It was necessary, Charles replied simply. But yes, it was difficult. I had to make hard choices, and not everyone understood or approved of my methods. Some of the other lords thought I was too involved in the day-to-day management, that I was lowering myself by dealing directly with tenants and tradesmen. But you rebuilt everything. Eventually, yes. The estates are now more profitable than they've ever been, and the tenant families are well housed and prosperous. But the experience taught me to trust my own judgment above all else, to never delegate important decisions without maintaining oversight. Emily was beginning to understand the man she had married much better, and that's why you seem so controlled, so careful about showing emotion. Partly. When you're responsible for so many people's livelihoods, when your decisions affect entire communities, you learn to think carefully before you act. Emotion can cloud judgment, and I couldn't afford to make mistakes. But Charles, Emily said gently, we're not talking about estate management now. We're talking about our marriage, our life together. Surely some emotion is not only acceptable but necessary. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face. You're right, of course. It's just difficult to change habits that have served me well for 20 years. I'm not asking you to change completely, Emily said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. I'm just asking you to trust me enough to let me see the man behind the Duke occasionally. Charles turned his hand palm up, capturing her fingers in his. You're very wise for someone so young, he said softly. I'm 19, not 9, Emily replied with a smile, and I've been observing people and situations my entire life. It's amazing what you can learn when you're expected to be seen and not heard. Another thing we have in common then, Charles said. I spent my youth watching and listening, trying to understand how the adult world worked. And now we're the adults, Emily observed. We get to decide how our world works. That evening, as they walked through the gardens in the soft twilight, Emily felt a contentment she hadn't expected to find in her arranged marriage. Charles had shed much of his formal reserve, and she was discovering that she genuinely enjoyed his company. The roses are beautiful, she commented, stopping to admire a particularly lovely bush covered in deep red blooms. My mother planted most of these, Charles said, his voice taking on a softer quality. She said a garden should be a place of beauty and peace, somewhere to escape from the pressures of the world. She sounds like she was a lovely woman. She was. Kind, gentle, but also strong when she needed to be. She would have liked you, I think. Emily felt a warm glow at the compliment. I wish I could have known her. She always said that the measure of a person wasn't their birth or their wealth, but how they treated those who couldn't help them in return. You have that quality, Emily. Emily looked up at him in surprise. How can you say that? You barely know me. I've been watching you, remember? The way you speak to the servants, how you've taken time to learn everyone's names, your genuine interest in Mrs. Whitmore's stories about the house's history. These things tell me a great deal about your character." They had stopped walking and were facing each other in the gathering dusk. Emily felt her heart begin to race as Charles stepped closer to her. "Emily," he said quietly, "may I— that is, would you mind if I kissed you? Properly this time." Emily's breath caught. The formal kiss at their wedding ceremony had been brief and public, but this would be different. Intimate, private, and entirely their choice. "Yes," she whispered, "I'd like that." Charles cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones as he looked into her eyes. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but as Emily responded, it deepened into something warmer and more passionate. Emily felt her knees grow weak as Charles's arms came around her, pulling her closer against his chest. She had never been kissed like this before, had never experienced the rush of sensation that seemed to flood through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Charles rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Emily," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know. This isn't just about duty or convenience anymore. What I'm feeling for you, it's real." Emily's heart soared at his words. "For me too," she admitted. "I never expected— I hoped we might become friends, but this is much more than friendship," Charles agreed, stroking her hair. "Emily, I want you to be certain about this, about us. I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated." Emily looked up into his grey eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the genuine concern for her feelings and well-being. "Charles, I'm not feeling pressured. I'm feeling hopeful, happy, things I didn't think I'd feel in this marriage. Are you saying you'd like to— that is, would you be comfortable if our marriage became more than just a partnership?" Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she said simply, "I think I'd like that very much." Charles's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Then perhaps," he said, offering her his arm, "we should retire for the evening." Emily took his arm, her heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. "Yes," she said, "I think we should." As they walked back toward the house together, Emily marveled at how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The terrified girl who had walked down the aisle was gone, replaced by a young woman who was discovering that love could indeed grow from the most unexpected circumstances. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, Charles proved to be as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a husband. He took his time, ensuring Emily's comfort and pleasure, showing her with actions what he had already told her with words, that she was cherished, valued, and loved. The blossoming. 2 months into their marriage, Emily woke to find Charles already dressed and standing by the window of their shared bedroom, reading a letter with a frown on his face. "Bad news?" she asked, sitting up and pulling the sheet around herself. Charles looked up, his expression softening as it always did when he saw her. "Not bad exactly, but complicated. We've been invited to spend a weekend at Ashworth Castle with the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth. It's a significant invitation. Lord Ashworth is one of the most influential men in the government." Emily felt a flutter of nervousness. "And you think we should accept?" "Politically, it would be wise. But Emily, I want you to know that these gatherings can be challenging. The Ashworths move in the highest circles of society, and some of their guests can be rather judgmental about newcomers." Emily got out of bed and moved to stand beside him, taking his hand. "Are you worried they'll find me lacking?" "I'm worried they'll be unkind to you," Charles said honestly. "You're young, beautiful, and you married one of the most eligible men in England. That combination tends to inspire jealousy among certain ladies of the ton." Emily considered this, then smiled. "Charles, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not the same frightened girl who married you 2 months ago. I've learned a great deal about being a duchess, and more importantly, I have something now that I didn't have then." "What's that?" "Confidence, and a husband who loves me." She stood on her toes to kiss him softly. "I think I can handle whatever the Ashworth's guests might throw at me." Charles's arms came around her, holding her close. "When did you become so wise and brave?" "I had a good teacher," Emily replied, smiling up at him. "Besides, I'll have you there with me. I can face anything as long as you're by my side." The weekend at Ashworth Castle proved to be exactly the test Emily had anticipated. The guest list included some of the most powerful and influential people in England, along with their equally formidable wives and daughters. Lady Ashworth, a handsome woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, greeted them with polite coolness. "Your Grace," she said to Charles with genuine warmth, then turned to Emily with considerably less enthusiasm. And the new Duchess of Davenport. How charming. You're even younger than I expected. Your Grace is too kind, Emily replied smoothly, executing a perfect curtsy. Thank you for including us in your gathering. Ashworth Castle is magnificent. Yes, well, it's been in my husband's family for 4 centuries. Some things simply cannot be bought, no matter how much money one might have. Emily felt Charles tense beside her at the subtle insult, but she maintained her composure. Indeed, Your Grace, history and tradition are precious things. Though I've always believed that what we do with our inheritance matters as much as what we inherit. Lady Ashworth's eyes sharpened, clearly recognizing that Emily was not going to be easily intimidated. The first evening's dinner was a formal affair with 20 guests seated around a massive table laden with crystal and silver. Emily found herself placed between Lord Pemberton, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, and Lord Blackwood, a man in his 30s with a reputation for wit and cruelty in equal measure. So, Your Grace, Lord Blackwood said as the first course was served, I understand this marriage was quite sudden, a whirlwind romance perhaps. Emily was aware that the conversation around them had quieted slightly, other guests clearly interested in her response. Not sudden at all, my lord, Emily replied calmly. His Grace and I were acquainted for some time before our engagement, though I suppose when one finds the right person, there's little point in unnecessary delay. How refreshingly practical, said Lady Blackwood from across the table, her tone suggesting she found nothing refreshing about it at all. Though I must say, Your Grace, you seem remarkably composed for a new bride. Some might say almost calculating. Emily felt the weight of the entire table's attention, but she had learned from Charles the value of remaining calm under pressure. I prefer to think of it as being grateful, Emily said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. After all, not every woman is fortunate enough to marry a man she both respects and loves. I consider myself extraordinarily lucky. She glanced down the table at Charles, who was watching the exchange with careful attention. When their eyes met, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod of approval, and what might have been the hint of a smile. Love, Lady Blackwood repeated with a slight laugh. How quaint. I had heard that the Duke of Davenport was far too practical for such romantic notions. Perhaps, Emily said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, you heard incorrectly. Or perhaps the right woman simply brings out different qualities in a man. Lord Pemberton, clearly sensing the tension, smoothly changed the subject to the recent political developments in Parliament, and the moment passed. But Emily was aware that she had been tested and had held her ground. After dinner, as the ladies retired to the drawing-room while the gentlemen enjoyed their port and cigars, Emily found herself surrounded by a group of women who seemed determined to find fault with her. Your gown is lovely, Your Grace, said Miss Thornton, a young woman whose own debut had been overshadowed by Emily's sudden elevation to Duchess. Though perhaps a bit elaborate for someone so young? Emily looked down at her gown of deep sapphire silk, which was elegant but hardly ostentatious. Thank you, Miss Thornton. I find that when one is representing one's husband and family, it's important to dress appropriately for the occasion. Oh, yes, said Lady Blackwood. I'm sure you're very conscious of representing the Davenport name properly. It must be quite a responsibility, stepping into such an established family. It is indeed a responsibility I take seriously, Emily replied, though I've found that the key to honoring a family's legacy is not simply maintaining what came before, but building upon it for the future. How ambitious of you, Lady Ashworth said, joining the group. Though I hope you don't plan to make too many changes too quickly. Some traditions are sacred. Emily sensed that this was the real test, whether she would be intimidated into promising to simply maintain the status quo, or whether she would assert her right to be an active participant in her new life. Of course, Your Grace, Emily said carefully, though I've learned from my husband that the best way to honor tradition is to ensure it remains relevant and meaningful. Stagnation, after all, is not preservation, it's decay. The silence that followed was telling. Emily had just demonstrated that she was not going to be a passive ornament in her marriage, but an active partner with her own opinions and ideas. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Charles immediately sought out Emily, his eyes scanning her face to assess how she had fared during his absence. Ladies, he said smoothly, I hope you've been making my wife feel welcome. Oh yes, Lady Ashworth replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We've been having a most enlightening conversation about tradition and change. My wife has very thoughtful perspectives on such matters, Charles said, his tone carrying a subtle warning. I find her insights quite valuable. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed in their guest chambers, Charles asked Emily about her interactions with the other ladies. They were testing me, Emily said simply, brushing out her hair, trying to see if I could be intimidated or dismissed as an upstart. And I held my ground without being openly confrontational. I think I passed their test, though I suspect I'm not going to be invited into their inner circle anytime soon. Charles moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders and meeting her eyes in the mirror. Emily, I want you to know how proud I am of you. Watching you tonight, your grace under pressure, your intelligence, your refusal to be cowed, it reminded me why I fell in love with you. Emily leaned back against him, feeling the warmth and strength of his support. I couldn't have done it without knowing you believed in me. I do believe in you, Charles said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. More than that, I'm grateful every day that you chose to give our marriage a chance, even though it wasn't really a choice at first, especially because of that. You could have simply gone through the motions, fulfilled your duty without ever opening your heart. Instead, you chose to see the possibility of something more. Emily turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the soft lamplight. Charles, do you ever regret not marrying for love the first time? I mean, waiting so long and then settling for an arrangement? Charles cupped her face in his hands, his grey eyes serious. Emily, I didn't settle. I found exactly what I needed, even if I didn't realize it at the time. What we have, it's not less than a love match. It's different, perhaps deeper, because we chose each other with our eyes wide open. You really believe that? I know it, Charles said firmly. Emily, what I feel for you, it's not the desperate passion of youth, but something steadier and stronger. It's love built on respect, understanding, and genuine partnership. It's the kind of love that will last a lifetime. As Emily fell asleep in her husband's arms that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. The terrified girl who had wept at her wedding was gone, replaced by a confident woman who had found not just security and position, but genuine love and partnership. The weekend at Ashworth Castle had been a trial by fire, but she had emerged stronger and more certain of her place in the world. She was the Duchess of Davenport, wife to a man she loved and who loved her in return, and she was ready for whatever challenges society might throw at her. The unexpected gift. 6 months into their marriage, Emily discovered she was with child. She had suspected for several weeks, but when Dr. Morrison confirmed her condition, she felt a mixture of joy and nervousness that left her almost breathless. She was sitting in the morning room, trying to decide how to tell Charles the news, when he appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. Emily? Mrs. Whitmore said Dr. Morrison was here. Are you unwell? Emily looked up at her husband, this man who had become the center of her world, and felt her heart overflow with love and anticipation. Quite the opposite, actually, she said, rising and moving toward him. Charles, I have something wonderful to tell you. Charles's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. What is it? Emily took his hands in hers, looking up into his grey eyes. We're going to have a baby. For a moment, Charles simply stared at her, as if he couldn't quite process what she had said. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure and radiant that Emily felt tears spring to her eyes. A baby, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily, are you certain? Dr. Morrison confirmed it. The baby should arrive in the spring. Charles swept her into his arms, spinning her around the room before setting her down gently and cupping her face in his hands. Emily, my darling, wonderful wife, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've made me the happiest man in England. Are you pleased? Emily asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. Pleased? Emily, I'm overjoyed. I'm going to be a father. He said the words as if he could hardly believe them. We're going to have a family. A proper family. Emily agreed, her own joy bubbling over. Charles, I love you so much. And I love you, Charles replied, kissing her tenderly. Both of you. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, Charles proved to be an attentive and devoted, expectant father. He insisted on accompanying her to every appointment with Dr. Morrison, read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, and showed a level of concern for her well-being that was both touching and occasionally overwhelming. Charles, Emily said one evening as they sat in the library, she with her embroidery and he with a medical text. You do realize that women have been having babies for thousands of years without their husbands reading every medical journal ever published? Charles looked up from his book with a slightly sheepish expression. I want to be prepared for anything that might happen. I want to be able to take care of you properly. You take wonderful care of me already, Emily said, setting aside her needlework and moving to sit beside him on the sofa. But Charles, you can't control everything about this process. Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out as they should. Charles set down his book and pulled her close against his side. I know you're right. It's just, Emily, I've never wanted anything as much as I want this. You, our child, our family. The thought of anything happening to either of you. Nothing is going to happen, Emily said firmly, placing his hand on her growing belly. Feel that? Your son or daughter is strong and healthy, just like their father. Charles's expression softened as he felt the baby move beneath his palm. Remarkable, he murmured. Absolutely remarkable. As winter turned to spring, Emily bloomed with her pregnancy. She had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did carrying Charles's child. He treated her like precious porcelain, constantly ensuring her comfort and happiness. The nursery is ready, Charles announced one afternoon in early April, leading Emily upstairs to show her the room he had been secretly preparing. Emily gasped as she entered the beautiful space. The walls were painted a soft yellow that would suit either a boy or girl, and the room was furnished with everything a baby could need. A beautiful wooden cradle that Charles had commissioned from the estate's finest carpenter, a comfortable chair for nursing, shelves lined with children's books, and toys that spoke of a father's eager anticipation. Charles, it's perfect, Emily breathed, running her hand over the smooth wood of the cradle. Our baby is so lucky to have you as a father. I hope I'll be worthy of the responsibility, Charles said quietly. I want to be the kind of father who is present, involved, loving, not distant and formal like so many men of our class. You will be, Emily said with absolute certainty. Charles, look how you've cared for me these past months. The love and attention you've shown. Our child will never doubt that they are wanted and cherished. On a beautiful morning in late April, Emily went into labor. Charles, despite all his preparation and reading, was nearly beside himself with worry and excitement. Should I send for Dr. Morrison again? He asked for the third time as Emily paced the bedroom, working through her contractions. Charles, darling, Emily said with a mixture of amusement and exasperation, Dr. Morrison is already here. He's downstairs having tea and waiting for things to progress. This is normal. Perhaps I should check on him, make sure he has everything he needs. Charles. Emily caught his hand as he started toward the door. Stay with me. I need you here. Charles immediately returned to her side, his face softening with concern. Of course. I'm sorry, I feel so helpless. You're not helpless, Emily assured him. You're here, and that's what matters. Hours later, as the sun was setting, their daughter was born. A perfect, healthy baby, with Charles's grey eyes and Emily's golden hair. She's beautiful, Charles whispered, his voice thick with tears as Dr. Morrison placed the baby in his arms. Emily, she's absolutely perfect. Emily, exhausted but radiant with joy, watched her husband hold their daughter with such tenderness and awe that her heart felt ready to burst. What shall we call her? Emily asked. Charles looked down at the tiny face peering up at him with solemn grey eyes. Catherine, he said softly, after my mother, Catherine Elizabeth Davenport. Lady Catherine, Emily said, smiling at her daughter. Welcome to the world, my darling. As Charles carefully placed baby Catherine in Emily's arms, he leaned down to kiss his wife's forehead. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything, for giving our marriage a chance, for loving me, for giving me this perfect daughter. Emily, you've given me a life I never dared to dream of. Emily looked up at her husband, this man who had started as a stranger and become the love of her life, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. We gave each other a chance, she corrected gently, and look what we built together. As they sat together in the soft lamplight, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Emily marveled at how love had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. What had begun as duty and fear had blossomed into the deepest joy and contentment she had ever known. The triumph of love. 2 years later, Emily stood in the gardens of Davenport House, watching Charles chase their toddling daughter Catherine around the rose bushes while she cradled their infant son, James, in her arms. Papa! Papa! Catherine squealed with delight as Charles caught her up in his arms, spinning her around until she dissolved into giggles. Emily smiled at the sight, her heart full as she watched the man who had once seemed so cold and intimidating, transformed into a devoted father who wasn't afraid to get grass stains on his knees or flowers in his hair if it made his children laugh. "Mama!" Catherine called, running toward Emily with her arms outstretched. "Look what Papa and I found!" She held up a perfect white rose, her grey eyes, so like her father's, sparkling with pride. "It's beautiful, darling," Emily said, adjusting baby James in her arms so she could properly admire Catherine's treasure. "Just like you." Charles approached, slightly out of breath, but grinning widely. "I believe our daughter has inherited your mother's eye for beauty," he said, dropping a kiss on Emily's forehead before gently stroking James's downy head. "How is our young lord this afternoon?" "Perfect, as always," Emily replied, looking down at her son's peaceful face. "I think he's going to have your temperament, calm and thoughtful." "While Catherine clearly has your spirit and determination," Charles observed, watching their daughter chase a butterfly with single-minded focus. As they settled on a garden bench together, Catherine playing at their feet while James dozed in Emily's arms, Charles took his wife's free hand in his. "Emily," he said quietly, "do you ever think about that first night? Our wedding night when I gave you that document?" Emily smiled, remembering the fear and uncertainty of that evening, and how Charles's unexpected gift of independence had been the first crack in the wall around her heart. "Often," she admitted. "It was the moment I realized you weren't the cold, calculating man I had feared you were. I was terrified," Charles confessed. "Here was this beautiful, intelligent young woman who had been forced into marriage with me, and I had no idea how to make her happy. All I could think to do was give you the freedom to leave if you chose to. And instead, it gave me the freedom to stay," Emily said softly. "To choose you, to choose us, without feeling trapped or coerced." "Do you ever regret it?" Charles asked. "Not having a traditional courtship, not marrying for love from the beginning?" Emily looked at her husband, this man who had given her everything she had never known she wanted: love, partnership, family, and a sense of purpose that went far beyond her own happiness. "Never," she said firmly. "Charles, what we have is better than a love match. We chose each other with our eyes wide open, built our love on a foundation of respect and understanding. What we have will last because it's based on more than just passion or infatuation." Charles brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "You've made me a better man, Emily. A better duke, a better husband, and now a better father. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." "And I love you," Emily replied, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. The duke, the man, the father of my children. You've given me a life beyond my wildest dreams." Catherine chose that moment to run back to them, climbing onto the bench between her parents with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world or her parents' love. "Story!" she demanded, settling herself comfortably against Emily's side. "Tell me the story about the princess and the duke." Emily and Charles exchanged a look of amusement. Catherine's favorite bedtime story was a highly romanticized version of her parents' courtship, one that Emily had crafted to emphasize the themes of kindness, patience, and love growing over time. "Once upon a time," Emily began, as she had countless times before, "there was a young princess who was very frightened because she had to marry a powerful duke she had never really met." As Emily told the familiar story, Charles listened with a smile, marveling at how his wife had transformed their somewhat unconventional beginning into a fairy tale that would teach their children about the power of kindness, the importance of choice, and the way love could grow and flourish when nurtured with patience and respect. "And did they live happily ever after?" Catherine asked, as she always did, even though she knew the answer. "They lived truthfully ever after," Emily replied, using Charles's words from years before, "which is even better than happy, because it means their love was real and strong and lasting." As the sun began to set over the gardens of Davenport House, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Emily reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered marriage as a frightened girl, convinced that her life would be nothing but duty and silence. Instead, she had found her voice, her strength, and a love that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The Tun had eventually accepted her completely, recognizing in the Duchess of Davenport a woman of intelligence, grace, and genuine warmth. She had become known for her charitable work, her support of education for young women, and her ability to bring out the best in everyone she encountered. But more than any public recognition, Emily treasured the private moments like this one, sitting in the garden with her husband and children, surrounded by the roses his mother had planted and the love they had cultivated together. "Charles," she said softly as Catherine dozed against her shoulder and James slept peacefully in her arms. "Thank you." "For what, my love?" "For that first gift on our wedding night. For showing me that love doesn't always begin with passion. Sometimes it begins with kindness and grows into something more beautiful than anything passion alone could create." Charles wrapped his arm around his family, pulling them close as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "No, Emily," he said, his voice full of wonder and gratitude. "Thank you for taking a chance on a man who had forgotten how to hope. For teaching me that the greatest strength isn't in controlling everything, but in being vulnerable enough to love and be loved in return." As they sat together in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the garden that had witnessed their first tentative steps toward love and now sheltered their growing family, Emily knew that their story would continue to unfold in ways they couldn't yet imagine. There would be challenges ahead, joys and sorrows, triumphs and difficulties, but they would face them all together, as partners, as lovers, and as the best of friends. The girl who had wept at her wedding had become a woman who smiled at her life, and the Duke who had been afraid to feel had become a man who loved without reservation. Together, they had proven that the most beautiful love stories aren't always the ones that begin with passion at first sight, but sometimes the ones that begin with a single act of unexpected kindness and grow, day by day, into something extraordinary. In the end, Emily and Charles discovered that the greatest gift they could give each other wasn't freedom from their marriage, but the freedom to choose love within it. Their story became a testament to the transformative power of patience, kindness, and the courage to open one's heart to unexpected possibilities. What began with tears of fear had blossomed into tears of joy, proving that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the most unlikely soil, and that love, when given the chance to flourish, can indeed conquer all.